Recording in progress.
Go ahead.
Good morning from Daldet at Delmartin United Methodist Church. My name is Ella Curry. I'll be serving as moderator today. And we're really happy to have as our speakers today, two who really require no introduction to us, but to do them the honor that they deserve. We'll have Mittie Quinn, who is our current representative on the delegation of the Baltimore Washington Conference, and she's a delegation to the jurisdictional conference that just took place this last week, and Mittie will be doing updates on developments there. And Neal Christie, who is currently on staff with the Baltimore Washington Conference, and
Executive Minister of Connected Engagement. So a lot of connection. That's my.
And actually, connection, I think, is Neal's middle name. Neal has, from both his years at the Board of Church and Society and the current work he's doing, is always looking to network, connect, and bridge people, relationships, and ministries around the church. And so Neal will be looking, when we think about the globe, Neal will be looking one step out in terms of looking at some potential implications for regionalization, which he will define and make sense of around the global church and including the United States. And I've provided for you today a map of the country, which primarily I've provided so that you can have a sense for the 5 jurisdictions that make up the United States. And the green upper right, Northeast delegation is where we are located. And then this should give you a perspective of the other 4 where they are, the sizes geographically, which are not representative of the size of the population. So we welcome today, and it's an honor to have both Mittie and Neal share their experience.
Thanks, Ella.
I said there's lots of nitty-gritty politics that goes on at jurisdictional, but I want to talk sort of about big picture outcomes, kind of signs of hope that I experienced in being there and that I got in terms of being with the Northeast Jurisdiction. But just so you know, all 5 of these jurisdictions were meeting simultaneously. So there was a great deal of texting going on amongst all of us who have connections all over the country saying, what's going on there? How is this going? How's that going? And it's a great cloud of witnesses, and I feel it a real privilege and honor to be there. I am the last lay person in terms of rank order, in terms of election, and I feel very honored. I'm the only white staff, female white person, lay person, who was on the delegation. The other white women that elected ahead of me are all staff people. As again, I feel very honored to be there. I was an alternate. I was put on the official delegation for a sad reason, really. One of the lay people, a queer out woman, Mary, became a deacon, I believe, and that made her ineligible to be serving as a lay person. So it's exciting that she is serving in the ministry, but that we lost her voice amongst the lay people. So these 5 jurisdictions met. The main reason is to elect bishops. I mean, this time around, because we have not met for 6 years because of this delay. By definition, the jurisdiction meets after the general conference meets, and we have not met. The general conference has been postponed. This was a specially approved session. It was approved by the Judicial Council, who ruled, which is like our Supreme Court, said you can have this meeting, and that you could elect bishops, and it would be okay with the rules. Because many of our bishops have retired. For example, in the Western jurisdiction, they were down to 1 or 2 bishops. We had lost 4 over the last 6 years. Actually, 2 of those we had lost before that. Anyway, so every place was electing bishops. The other 4 jurisdictions were all electing 3. We agreed to elect 2 in the Northeast. So,
and there were also resolutions that had come from a progressive office of individuals working on these questions since 2019 when we had what we at Dumbarton sort of called the apocalypse, general conference. The three resolutions that were written and submitted had to do with endorsing the Christmas covenant, which Neal will speak about, but also setting up a committee or a group in the Northeast to, in the next few years, until we have a general conference, to consider what that means and how we might implement it. There was also a resolution about centering peer voices and reaffirming their leadership in our jurisdiction. And then it was called calling to center justice and empowerment for peer and LGBT voices. And then there was another one called Leading with Integrity that was encouraging our brothers and sisters who are planning to leave the United Methodist Church to step down from their leadership roles and allow the people who are committed to staying within the United Methodist Church to be the leaders on committees and commissions and local churches, etc. As you can imagine, there was a great deal of discussion about these beforehand, but I will tell you they all passed with the majority of the vote. There was without much discussion. So that was exciting. That's a sign of hope that I see that there's support in the Northeast. The idea of visualization, we'll talk about that, to affirm the queer folk in our midst and the ministries and their participation in the church and leading with integrity. That we ask that everyone be honest and faithful with themselves and with the church about where their heart is and where their the other piece that we engaged in is episcopal elections. As I said, each group was doing this. Each jurisdiction did their process differently. For example, the Western jurisdiction opened nominations to anyone who felt home. They had over 80 people respond. They were able to kind of narrow that down to about 31 or 2. So when they started their meetings this week, they had 30 plus people who were committed and also interested in being elected as bishops. They had interviewed all of them ahead of time for various needs. My understanding is that on the first ballot, they were able to amend the rules so that they cut it down to about 15. But they did not elect their bishops until Friday, the last day, the last hours they were able to come to consensus. Another sign of hope is that all of the bishops that were elected are what we would consider progressive. They have all committed to honoring the abeyance at least until 2024. Most of them have committed to beyond that they will ordain LGBTQIA candidates who have been affirmed and are qualified to be in the ministry, having gone through seminary and training in those things. And that they will not entertain charges to be brought against clergy who perform same-gender. So that is a real sign of hope and very exciting. In the Northeast, we elected with fairly amount of unanimity Reverend Hector Burgos, who is a Hispanic clergy person, who is the first in the Northeast jurisdiction to be elected. He is a delightful human being and a wonderful pastor and clergy. I'm thrilled. And I'm doubly thrilled because he's been assigned to my home conference in Upper New York. So I'm very excited about that. They've had a difficult 12 years, I would say. And he's just a very warm. Anyway, I told him I was rooting for him since I grew up there. Another exciting piece is the Southeast, which, as you know, is a very conservative section of the country. The first person elected was Reverend Tom Berlin, who is from Virginia and is very active in the Reconciling Ministries movement in Northern Virginia. So he was the first to be elected bishop in Southeast.
I'm not familiar with the other two that were elected, but I'm told that they are both
Sure.
progressive folks.
Yep.
In the South Central, which includes Texas, the first three elected on the first ballot were three people whose names had been put forward by the progressive caucuses of that South Central jurisdiction. One, it is also our first Native American bishop is from that jurisdiction. A Black woman who was the first Black woman to be elected in that South Central jurisdiction. And Hispanic.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's very exciting. In the West, they go through this elaborate process. Some of you know Cedric Bridgeforth, who spoke in our annual conference and was the chair of the Black Methodist Church Renewal for a number of years, was the second person elected in the Western jurisdiction. Cedric is a gay Black clergy person, and so that's a huge excitement all the way around. The first person elected was the first Filipino bishop to ever be elected in our connection. And the third was a Hispanic woman who had been in the running last time to become bishop, but she stepped aside so that Karen Oliveto would be elected in the Western jurisdiction. In the North Central, the first person elected is a Black woman who will be now stepping down. She's the chair of the connectional table and has really led that group through some very difficult conversations and some discernment processes with the grassroots, and was, I would say, pretty heavily responsible for getting a resolution forward about the need for regionalization
From the US.
from the US, right? So that's what happened in the NEJ. There was one other resolution passed which would support parents of young children that we will provide childcare and a lactation area for nursing mothers. We had a 18-month-old in sessions with us, reminding us of how much we care about our kids. This was the woman who actually put the proposal forward. She had no choice but to just bring her little girl. So there, at one point, there was a little playpen in the aisle, and she had a stroller, and she would sing and talk. I must say we had some good discussions in the Northeast jurisdiction. We had a whole session where we had a report from the call to action. At the last jurisdictional meeting 6 years ago, we all committed to work on the systemic racism that's in our church and in our persons and in our organizations. And there was a report from them. And then there was almost an hour when our brothers and sisters of color were provided time to come and speak about the hurt and harm that has gone on for generations for them. And that was a much needed conversation, and just very spiritual and moving for all of us to be reminded of how much is still alive and well, and very sad. There was also confrontation of the bishops in terms of the way that they chaired meetings. If they cut a speaker off for whatever reason, sometimes there was someone called them on it and said, "Excuse me, Bishop, but that just felt like you cut that person off without any." So in view of trying to keep the time, sometimes they would be more brusque and brisk on doing things. There was a lot of time spent on discussing the rules. This is the part that just sometimes I miss you, Jen Ilo. Jen was the chair of the rules committee for this body for years. God bless her. Bless you if you're out there, Jen. And we have a new chair, and she did a noble job, but it was there were many times when there were questions of procedure, about rules, about order, especially in the beginning about getting going. And in the end, when we were trying to decide how we could come to some closure. I just want to say a few words about that. We ended up, although we went and were expecting to elect 2 bishops, there had been a special session 2 weeks ago via Zoom because the College of Bishops, which is the bishops in our area, had recommended
that we not elect any bishop. The General Church Committee on Finance recommended that we hold the line and that there be no growth in terms of the episcopacy, because financially, we are not certain about where things are going. If many churches disaffiliate, that will lower our budgets and our collections. But we as a body met 2 weeks ago and agreed that we wanted to elect 2 bishops because we have 9 episcopal areas. Right now, we have only 5 bishops because over the last 6 years, 4 retired. And so we felt that at a minimum, we should elect 2 to cover the area, especially because the 2 of the bishops who retired were serving the largest areas geographically. Upper New York, which is now all the way from Buffalo to Albany and down to the Pennsylvania line, almost. Greater New York comes in there on the lower part of it. And New England is all of the states, except for a small portion of Connecticut. I think that's part of that. New York, Greater New York, Western. That's Western Connecticut. We elected Reverend Burgos, and then there was pretty much of a stalemate. And one of the candidates was from Western Pennsylvania, endorsed by the Wesley Covenant Association, which is a very conservative group, which has been working largely and working not too secretly to create the global Methodist Church, which you have heard of. So one of the candidates was from there, happened to be a woman. One of the candidates was from New England, a very vibrant, talented Black queer clergy person who was not on the docket to be interviewed ahead of time. So I forgot that step. 9 people, they were endorsed by either a caucus or by their annual conference to have their names put forward. We spent an entire day interviewing those people, those 9 candidates, and we got a bio from them ahead of time. There were this gentleman, this clergy person, Reverend J. Williams from New England, was not on that list. So there was not the opportunity to interview him. Instead, his name was put in from the floor in what we call write-in ballot. No, well, yes, write-in ballots. He had a number of this. He's a member, it's a delegate. So looks into the weeds, I'm sorry. His name was put up by, primarily by New England. But he did not have a chance to speak. That's not allowed in our rules. You can nominate someone from the floor, but there's no opportunity for them to speak to the body or be interviewed in a formal way as these 9 were. Different groups could catch him and ask him to come and meet with them. And I don't know whether any of the annual conferences did that. I saw some of them huddled around him to get to him. So he was the other candidate. As the day went on, our own Giovanni Arroyo was one of the recommended. Kristen De La Rosa, a very talented Hispanic leader in the church. Sang Wan Do, a Korean centrist progressive from New Jersey, and 2 from this Western PA. In the course of the interviews, the 2 from Western Pennsylvania answered questions about ordination and said they would uphold the current book of discipline. They would not honor the abeyance, that they would not ordain openly queer and LGBTQ clergy. And they would entertain if complaints came about persons doing same-gender weddings. So that was the slate of 9 that we heard from. Again, we did not have a chance to hear from Reverend Williams about some of his positions on some of those things, or to have him speak, which was unfortunate. So after 2 days, after a day of balloting, a number of people had dropped, and the Reverend Webb Dunn, the woman from Western PA, and Reverend J. Williams had risen to the top of the list, but they were stalemate in a dead heat, I would say. And there were not enough extra votes for either of them to go over the top. So there was a concern that we needed to find some other alternative. There was concern among the Baltimore-Washington delegation that there was some drift towards electing the clergywoman from Western PA for a myriad of reasons. And so Baltimore-Washington, a coalition of our members, offered another option, which was the name of Reverend Tony Love, who is well known in our annual conference. He is a progressive, he is a leader, he is the current president of Black Methodists for Church Renewal. He happened to be the chair of the sessions committee, so he was there. People had seen him as he taught us about how to use our devices and those kinds of things, and he was around making motions. We felt he had also been considered by our annual conference to put forward as a name, and was second or third in line in terms of our supporting him. Several of us said, well, if we'd gone one more round on voting about who we wanted to send to jurisdictional, he probably would have been chosen. So we felt excited about him as an option, and we put his name in from the floor, just as Reverend Williams' name had. The stalemate continued. A number of people thought that Reverend Love, that we had suggested, was a great idea. There was some movement from both Reverend Williams and from Reverend Webb Dunn on the Western Pennsylvania, because Reverend Love is very much of a centrist, a moderate person, a moderate leader. And so it also gave a person where the people who didn't feel they could vote for either Reverend Williams or Reverend Webb Dunn, someone that might be an exciting leader. After a couple of rounds, Reverend Love, again, everything sort of stalled, and Reverend Love withdrew his name, as did Reverend Gio Arroyo, and Reverend Song Wanjo, the Korean clergy that was considered. So now we're back really with two options, and things didn't go anywhere. They really scaled. Sort of in the last minute, there was some recognition that Reverend De La Rosa, the Hispanic woman, had not withdrawn her name. So she was gaining some momentum, but it was almost midnight on Thursday. So the people who had originally not wanted to elect two bishops were trying to figure out how to cut off the election. And so the decision of the body, after many machinations and attempts at figuring out how to stop this stalemate and go forward, was to make a motion that we would elect our second bishop in 16 months when the next jurisdictional meeting will be held. It was a creative idea. Many of us were wounded, many felt relief, but it was something that was approved by the majority of the body. So we have one new bishop, he is progressive. We did not elect a bishop that will insist on upholding the book of discipline. We will see what happens in 16 months. So that's where we are. Many signs of hope. As I said, the bishops that have been elected are all progressive across the country, which is huge. I guess if we had elected someone from who was a Wesley Covenant supported clergy, I would have felt really defeated. But I felt that we did the best we could in the situation that we had, and so that's what happened. And so signs of hope and signs of moving forward. I will say one other thing. It became very clear that during the pandemic, we have become extremely silent. Before pandemic, I had the honor to serve on a Northeast Jurisdictional Board of Ordained Ministry, where all of the chairs of boards of ordained ministry from each of these areas, annual conferences, come together. They came together about 3 times a year to exchange information about how they were discerning people's call, how were they welcoming new young people into the ordained ministry, how were they coping with gay, were they accepting LGBTQIA candidates at that time? No one was acknowledging it. That group worked very hard to get everyone to agree to remove any questions about one's sexuality or gender identity from the candidacy process. That was huge. But I discovered in being there this week that many of the episcopacy areas have gone back to being very rigid in their interpretation, that they are not ordaining any LGBTQI candidates that may come forward. While they are, I don't think there have been any complaints now. It does leave me with a good feeling about what might go on forward. Anyway, I talked about, Neal's going to talk about this regionalization, which was really another real sign of hope in what we're doing. You'll hear talk about the Christmas covenant, but also there's a connection table, but both of them are talking about the need for regionalization.
Sure. I feel like I've just been to jurisdictional court, and I don't need to watch the videos and re-traumatize myself on several. And I want to celebrate. I just want to celebrate that David Wilson, who was elected First Native American Bishop of the United Methodist Church after more than 200 years, preached in this church. Some of you may remember David, a group of Indigenous people came for the Indigenous Peoples March. I said to David, well, come to my church. I want this group to come to my church. We're going to come to the march. So we were, I celebrate that. I also celebrate that Hector comes from my home conference, Greater New Jersey, and I remember when he was in seminary. So walking with him, and Christie de la Rosa, who was gaining at votes, was the first person to cook me dinner in Washington, D.C. When I moved here. She was a member of the Baltimore Washington Conference. And so I could go on and on with several, and Cedric is a close friend of mine, so I celebrate.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I also want to celebrate and did this at jurisdictional. Gio Arroyo, each person that was a candidate could take another delegate with them. In past, often the candidates have brought a spouse, but it just so happens that Gio's husband, Leo, is a delegate from the Baltimore, Washington area. And so Leo went with Gio on these interviews. And Gio, I'm gonna cry. Gio introduced Leo as his partner and husband as well as a delegate, right up front, and brought his authentic self. And that was huge. That I just give thanks for his witnesses and Leo's too to the jurisdiction. And an ordained deacon. Leo.
And an ordained deacon.
Oh, that's right.
Yes, we can say, yeah. And I think what I want to say is I want to give you sort of a 20,000 foot, a 5,000, and a 10-foot vision of what regionalization means, because this is going to be the language between now and 2024. And I say this as a member of, some of you have been part of the Christmas Covenant webinar that we've held here through the Labyrinth thing, the denominational task force conversations. If I say anything that's repetitive, forgive me. I'm going to try to be as succinct as I can, not get into any constitutional changes that are proposed, but what do we mean by regionalization and why we're calling for regionalization? If you look at this map, what Mittie was talking about is only a part of the United Methodist Church, these 5 jurisdictions, okay? And this is not including some of our relationships, because we have churches in the South Pacific as well that relate to the CalPAC conference, but and churches in Canada, which relate to the Alaska conference. So this is a part of the United Methodist Church, but it's not the whole United Methodist Church. Keep in mind, the United Methodist Church, when it was born, before it was formally born as the United Methodist Church, we had missionary relationships across the world. When the church was born, we started to redefine what those relationships would look like. So we have autonomous and affiliated relationships with Methodist churches across Central and Southern America, parts of Europe, parts of Africa, but predominantly in this hemisphere. So from the birth of the United Methodist Church in the late 1960s to 2022, we've seen exponential growth in parts of the church. But I want to keep this in context And I want to give you some numbers, because we're talking about regionalism in the global church. It's important to look at the numbers. Based on the statistics from 2-3 years ago, the United Methodist Church in the United States is about 6,500,000. In Africa, in Europe, which includes Northern Europe, Germany, Eurasia, Central Europe, the Philippines, Asia, we have a new conference that's just been birthed in Laos. We have a new conference a couple of years ago that was birthed in Vietnam, Mongolia. We have about 6,464,000. So there's almost parity between the two, right? The US and outside the United States. And yet we function still as a US central church. So while I celebrate the progressive bishops that have been elected, the challenge for us, those of us who are supporting regionalism, and I'm speaking, imagining my dear colleagues, Karen, who's a member of the New York conference here, Karen Presente, United Methodist Women on staff in the Philippines, Richard, who is in the Western jurisdiction, and then Israel Alvaran, who some of us know with RMN staff. We represent the US team for the Christmas Covenant. We have a team in Africa, we have a team in Europe, we have a team in the Philippines as well. So the numbers are important to me. The annual conferences in the United States, 54, but there are 80 annual conferences, similar to Baltimore Washington Conference, with numbers that actually are higher. Membership is higher in many of these conferences. They're in Africa, Europe, the Philippines, Asia. Bishops, 54 in the US, 20 across the globe. Missionaries. Now I want to that's the bureaucratic piece of it. Now here's the ministry piece of it. 677 missionaries globally, US global. 550 relief workers, 97 community centers globally, 108 universities, colleges globally, $6.3 billion given in 2019 for the United Methodist Church. So that gives you a sense of how much money is out there. The Christmas Covenant followed the debacle of the 2019 General Conference. Yes, on the table, Bishop Bingham Sai Kaditha was instrumental with the connectional table in proposing a regional US conference, right? To replace what we have now as 5 jurisdictions, possibly maintaining 5 jurisdictions, but having one US region that could then relate to the regions that we have outside the United States. That was a US-centered proposal. Those on the Christmas Covenant celebrated, but what we found was after 2019, all the proposals for restructuring the United Methodist Church had been birthed within the US, within the bounds of the US. There were no proposals that were coming from outside the United States. We had the African bishops and the Philippine bishops and the European bishops, especially Bishop Alstead, the bishop in Germany, say, we desire a united Methodist Church. We disagree when it comes to where we are on many of our issues, but we want to stay as a United Methodist Church. But they did issue statements calling for the unity of the church. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, the African bishops, and some of you may have read this statement, were very clear that the Wesley Covenant Association and Global Methodist Church have no place in their Episcopal areas, and they call for congregations to distance themselves. They want to stay in the United Methodist Church. Well, what does that look like? What does it look like when we have a United Methodist Church that does not look like this? Okay, this is only half of the United Methodist Church. The Christmas Covenant and regionalism makes this proposal. We begin with our values. We envision a church that connects globally, engages in mission together, respects contextual ministry, that celebrates the diversity of God's creation in its many beautiful expressions, values mutuality, empowering relationships in order to strengthen our core mission of evangelism, discipleship, social witness for the transformation of the world. So how does the Christmas Covenant, how's regionalism achieve this? I'll only give you 6 points. Number 1, the Christmas Covenant legislation will create regional equity, which we do not have in the United Methodist Church right now. It will transform the central conferences outside the United States and the United States jurisdictions all into regional conferences that can relate to each other as regions with the realities of contextual realities that emerge as being regions. Number 2, the changing name alone will address the racism that's been embedded within our church from the very beginning. The notion of jurisdictional, of a central conference is reminiscent of the segregated, legislated segregated Methodist Church, Methodist Episcopal Church in the US, where if you're a Black clergy member, if you're a Black congregation, you're part of a central jurisdiction. Okay, so when the United Methodist Church was birthed, we got rid of that. Doesn't mean we got rid of racism. Certainly, it's been maintained in every form, but we legally legislated it out, but we maintained it outside the United States. All right, so outside the United States, we have central conferences. So the language change alone starts to shift our understanding of where are we centering our attention? Where's the power in the church? Number 3, constitutional amendments will strengthen the ability of regional conferences to adapt to the Book of Discipline to meet missional needs. Currently, if you live in Germany, if you live in Manila, if you are living in Norway, you can change your central conference can adapt the Book of Discipline to your missional needs. They've been able to do that since their inception, from the very beginning. The United States cannot adapt or amend the Book of Discipline except at General Conference. It's the one place every 4 years. Well, what happens during the rest of those 4 years? We have what we've been experiencing for decades. We see growth in some areas, we see church closings in others, we see new ministries being birthed, but we don't have a forum, a venue, whereby region, jurisdictions, the US is one region to talk about what does it mean to be United Methodist Church in this ever-shifting context. This would give the United States an opportunity to do what they're already doing in Germany, what they already do in the Philippines, what they already do in Central Congo, what they do in East Africa, what they do in Northern Europe. We can set our own agenda of what it looks like to be the United Methodist Church in this context for mission and ministry. Number 5, the Christmas Covenant would create this regional conference. It would authorize the Book of Discipline, immediate changes in the Book of Discipline, immediately following the adjournment of the 2024 General Conference. Meaning, after the adjournment of the 2024 General Conference, a new regional US conference could be called immediately, which would include the delegates to the General Conference and their representatives from the central conferences. And then finally, the Christmas Covenant supports, and this is unlike the connectional table proposal originally, supports the current, for the time being, the current structure of the Methodist Church, meaning the Judicial Council, the Council of Bishops, the 7 boards and agencies of the Methodist Church, the revised social principles, which took 8 years of global work to produce, which, if you haven't looked at them, has deleted any exclusive condemnatory language around human sexuality and around marriage. And so those matters are already cared for in the social principles. Now the question is getting it into the Book of Discipline when it comes to clergy responsibilities. Why do we want the regional conferences? Geography matters. It matters where we live. It matters how we live together. The benefit and the opportunities are great to be in life and ministry together across our region, and to imagine what new ministry could look like. We know that at General Conference every 4 years, when we meet, the majority of the business details are from the US perspective already. This would give us an opportunity at General Conference to talk about what is going on really in the globe. Okay, so the US would be able to deal with its US matters as the US is a region, so that when we do gather, we can truly be a global church. We can live into what that looks like. All right. This is some question you're wondering, I'm sure, based on Mittie's presentation. What about inclusion of LGBTQI people? What about the implicit heterosexism in the United Methodist Church? What about marriage equality? What about ordination? What does the Christmas Covenant and regionalism say about this? We say 3 things. Number 1, the Christmas Covenant ensures that no regional conference can be forced to do anything against its will. Meaning, the U.S. as a regional conference sets its own, legislates its own understanding of ordination, clergy responsibilities. The social principles will remain global. So any condemnatory language on homosexuality has already been expunged. Those of us that were, and I was the staff person for that process. So with my chair, Dr. Randall Miller, and Dean Mayor Elizabeth Moore at Boston University, we made sure that this would be an inclusive social principle. Okay, so the U.S. would still be able to navigate our differences of opinion, which remain. We saw them in Western Pennsylvania around ordination, clergy responsibilities, and marriage. And so we could do this, and there's several ways to do it. They don't get immediately changed because we become a regional conference, but when we become a regional conference, we can immediately act on these matters. And then three, this recognizes the sacred value of all people that were made in God's image, that the Christmas covenant envisions a ministry that will always be contextual. It will not center the US perspective, meaning that we cannot force the Philippines, Liberia, Congo, Kenya, we cannot force them to change their perspectives, but we can stay in relationship with them in new ways, more equitable relationship. What are some of the objections? This just adds another layer of bureaucracy to an already complicated structure. And some of you may believe that. In fact, it simplifies our structure. It's important for us to have a healthier, more nimble way of acting in ministry. We can save money and time that is expended in general conference on business has nothing to do with the global church. The structure will become less colonial. Second objection, it is too US centric. It dismisses the Central Conference. We're a global church. No, it does not. The Central Conference leaders have endorsed this. I have Central Conferences from the Philippines that have endorsed it, leaders as well. And we have tacit support from the bishops in Africa. The Central Conferences, as I said, already exercise freedom in what they're able to do in terms of meeting their ministry. This is a gift of the Central Conferences to the regional US church. And then finally, this does not address full inclusion directly. And to that, I would say, my colleagues would say, this addresses the neo-colonial structure that currently affects our church. When we address this, we will address justice at all levels in the church. Racism, heterosexism, neoliberal capitalism as it functions within our church, how we fund the church, how we do not fund the church. These are matters that we can discuss as a region. And so, at that, I will stop. I got more about stuff.